and storms. Several years later, she was moved to room 12, which was full of Madonnas and children, their heads encased in golden halos. The Madonnas tilted their heads at the babies, who had the faces of fat old men. One baby bared sharp teeth, and she had felt her own empty breast aching. She was glad when she was moved to room 38, portraits of thin-lipped generals standing solemn by their steeds. For the past 5 years, she had been in room 47, with its calm seas and distant lighthouses, and no one had come close enough to the paintings to warrant her rising from her chair. At closing time, she went home and heated up soup and sandwich and crawled into her small, clean bed, where she dreamed of calm seas and distant lighthouses. More and more, there were days when she spent hours looking out the windows at the parking lot or the cafe across the street. The tourists mostly ignored her, but when they spoke, they asked the same questions. Where are the toilets, the gift shop, the exit? And she would retrieve a map from her pocket and point with a long pencil. On the day she was moved to room 21, she followed the museum director through the marble hallways and listened as he explained that since she had been working there longer than anyone, he trusted her with this very, very important assignment. Do not, under any circumstances, let someone touch the painting. Do not let crowds gather around the painting. Do not let children within 10 feet of the painting. Explain that there are postcards of the painting available for sale in the gift shop. And posters too, of course. Of course, she said. Et voila, said the museum director, and gestured toward the wall. The painting was not particularly large nor particularly small. There were no dancing women or writhing saints, no one being tortured or adored. In fact, there were no humans at all. Just a purple mountain rising behind a pine tree, growing to the left of the painting and sweeping out across the top. Or at least she supposed it was meant to be a pine tree. It's nice, she said, because the museum director seemed to expect a response. It leaves me speechless too, he said, and left her there. Just a mountain, she thought, sitting on her velvet chair. And of course the tree draped across the top of the canvas, and some orange houses stacked against slabs of green and yellow. Well, not exactly yellow, a different yellow than she'd seen before. What could it be called? She thought she had seen all the yellows there were. But still, it was just a mountain. The tour groups came to see it, and she rose from her chair and said, "Spread out," and waved her arms so they would understand. The art students tried to get too close, and she scattered them away as if they were cats going after table scraps. When they had moved back an appropriate distance, a shaggy-headed art teacher talked about light, space, motif, of convex shadows, chromatic variations, counterbalance. "It's just a mountain," she said to them, but not out loud. No one dancing, no one being shot full of arrows, no one at all. Just a purple and yellow mountain with blue-gray shadows, though somehow the green and blue air behind it seemed to be in motion. She listened to hear if the art teacher would mention the swirling air or the smells of pine and rosemary and distant hearth fire, which must be coming from one of the orange-yellow houses squatted in the fields. She listened to hear if he would talk about the knobby bark of the pine tree and the way the trunk would sway in strong winds. But he talked about cones and cylinders and spheres. She stared at the mountain and she watched the light change on its surface, and sometimes the pine tree was so fragrant she breathed it in and held her breath until she was dizzy. Soon the tour groups and the art students began to watch her. They stood with their backs to the famous masterpiece, and they stared at the woman on the velvet chair, her eyes aglow. They talked of her chromatic variations and the lines of her Byzantine mouth. The museum director was annoyed at first, but when he saw how many more people were coming, paying the admission fee and shopping at the gift shop, he decided not to disturb her. He put a velvet robe across the room and let in groups of 30 at a time. At closing time, he nudged her gently, and she would rise and gather her coat and walk home through the dark streets. At home, she fixed dinner and ate without tasting and slept without dreaming. And in the morning, her feet took her back to the museum, to her velvet chair in room 21, where she climbed the mountain, her fingers grasping the cold rock. She tramped barefoot over tiny snails, clinging to the weeds, through lavender, past its prime. She picnicked under the pine trees, and she slept on the pine needles. And one day she walked to town and knocked on the door of one of the yellow lavender houses and met a man who took her dancing and kissed her beneath the pine tree. She gave birth to a baby with small teeth who sucked at her breast, and when the baby was older, they took him to the mountain and let him scramble over the rocks and play with the tiny snails. At night, they slept in the yellow lavender house, all three curled up in one warm bed. One day, the woman didn't move at closing time. The museum director nudged her harder, then sighed. He thought he might leave her there just a little longer, just a few more days. Her face was so lovely, and her skin was cold and smooth as marble. So, do you want to know where this came from? Okay. The first one, several years ago, Gordon Ramsay came to Starkville to film Hotel Hell. And it was very exciting when he was there, and I was desperate to see him. And I would drive around, like, where could he be? And people were citing him everywhere. Like, he was at the pool, he was at this bar, he was there, And I became a little obsessed. And Troy and I actually won one of the, like, a lottery to be in the, like, they film you like eating in you know, we didn't make it on the show, but we were like, they're following us around with like the cameras, and like, are we supposed to say something bad about the food? Like, I don't know, it's fine. But it was exciting. And so I thought, so I just took that idea of like someone coming to transform something and just took it like too ridiculous. It just kept getting weirder and weirder. And I was like, maybe they just build a mountain and maybe the dogs start talking and maybe who knows what happens. So that's where that came from. And then the other one came from when I was 10 years ago or so, I had a sabbatical and I got to go to France, and I got to study with some art students in the south of France, in Aix-en-Provence, where Cézanne painted. And so I got to go with the art students and go out into the field where he painted his mountain, Mont Saint-Victoire, and the mountains in the background. And the art teacher's talking about all the technical stuff. And I was thinking, I don't know any of that, what the terminology means, but I think the mountain is cool. Like, I like, you know, the painting. So it's sort of like, what if somebody can be swept away by art? And then what happens if they really get swept away by art? So I think that's a fun thing to do. Like, just take something that on its own didn't have enough interest for me to write about, and then just make it really strange. So I think that's a fun writing exercise to try. Do something weird, you know, just to go there, you know.
Is that something that you find yourself doing a lot, or just something that you like to do to take yourself out of like a make-for-make project?
That's a good question. I think sometimes when I get really stuck on something, I think, well, what strange thing could happen? Like, how could I just push it out of reality a little bit? And so yeah, and so I don't know when it's going to happen. You know, sometimes I didn't start off. Neither of these started off like these are going to be surreal, whatever. It just was like, yeah, I'm just stuck. Something weird's going to happen now. So.
I recognized instantly Gordon Ramsay's
Yeah.
start ball. It was very weird, and you made it so much more wonderful than it really was. So I appreciate it.
Did you see him?
No, no. I was one of the people wandering around and around looking for him.
Yeah.
No, I never saw him.
Yeah, and then it got really just disappointing when he was like, "Oh no, I know who you are. You're not him." You know, it's like it's just regular people. But,
and then the episode was also sort of disappointing. Like, he sort of liked.
He was very nice. He was really
very sweet about it.
He was very sweet.
Not cruel at all.
No,
That's right.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
It reflected well on Starkville, I guess.
It did. Yeah. It was nice.
So I have some questions prepared for you,
Great.
but I do want to mention again, if anyone else or anyone on Zoom has questions, just hop in and we'll answer those. So, yeah. I want to start off with sort of what drew you to short stories versus like novels or some other type of writing?
Well, I think so. I love reading novels, of course. And I think the first thing I ever tried to write when I was like in 6th grade, when you're like, I'm going to write a book, you're in 6th grade or whatever, was like a novel. I think I made it to like 30 pages on like notebook paper with the print kept getting bigger and bigger because I was like, I wanted more pages. But I think it's one, definitely reading a lot of short stories, like Flannery O'Connor, James Baldwin, like those classics that I read when I was young, and they just sort of like, that's when you can do that in that short amount of space. And I also like being able to finish something. Like I like being able to, with a novel, it's, I've tried to write them. I've written a few, very not that good. But there's something in terms of the process of it that I like. In a couple of months, I know I'll have something, or less than a month. And if I don't, it's fine. Moving on, and I have a bunch of them going all at once. But I do. I think I like what you can do with a short story. Like sometimes they can feel like a novel. Yeah. But I have tried writing novels, and it's a whole different thing. It's harder to, I think, for me to maintain the pace. Like something has to happen over a long period of time, and that's why I'm sort of sticking with stories.
Excellent. You mentioned that you do reading others work kind of like would influence you, but like how does reading other short stories or even other novels you mentioned that you like affect your writing?
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes it just sort of it's always inspiring. That is the most inspired. The things I do whenever I feel stuck is just read. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes I just don't realize what a story can do. Like every time I read the Flannery O'Connor story, A Good Man Is Hard to Find. Like the tone of that, if anyone's read it, it starts off really like this family's going to Florida, and it's very funny, and there's like children in the backseat fighting, and there's a cat, and then suddenly it takes a really scary turn, and you can change tone like that, and it works. And I mean, she can do it. Or like a writer named Alice Munro, her stories can span like 40 years in a story. Or with the story Sonny's Blues, which is one of my favorite stories, like the way the language reflects the music at the end of the story, and the way he does this thing where he inserts his great big flashback section in the middle of the story. I'm like, all right, I'm going to try that. I can't do it as well, but it's like, so it's things that, when I first read a story, I read it to love it, and then I go back and like, why did I love that? How did they do that? It's like this magic that you try to figure out.
Awesome. So I have this question, and I'm not a writer, and so especially for you writing short fiction, what do you come up with first? Is it plot or is it characters?
It's characters. So even with the celebrity story, like I feel like the town was sort of a character, like it, and I had to figure out like, what does this town need to go through? And then with the museum person, like again, that's sort of character. Like if I start off with a plot, I usually get stuck or I lose interest. I have to figure out like, who is the character and what do they need to go through? And hopefully like plot comes out of character.
Right.
If I'm lucky. But it's very rare that a character will come out of a plot for me. And there's some people that works for them perfectly, but for me it's harder to do that. Like there has to be a person and then stuff happening, as opposed to stuff happening and then a person. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I also use, like in terms of characters, like I use my family a lot for characters. They don't necessarily know this. And then I sort of think like, take a variation of somebody, even maybe somebody I don't even know that well, like a grandmother who I didn't really know that well, but I knew something about her, and I wrote about her, thinking about taking what I knew about her, but turning her into a slightly different person. in sort of trying to figure out the mysteries.
You might like magnify a part of an individual, and then that's the inspiration for a specific character.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it is fun.
Do you feel like it's, I mean, you mentioned characters are really like a driving point for you, but like, so when you're writing, it's really like all about the characters and developing strong characters, or do you also try and fit in plot twists or anything different?
It's sort of like I try to figure out, because you can't just have a character. Like it's not just a character like sketch. Like something has to happen to them. And sometimes I try to avoid the plot twist, but there have been times when I'm writing and I'm like, oh, that is going to happen to this character. Like but I don't know that until I've gone like far through the story. And maybe there's a clue, like, so when I start, I don't really know what's going to happen. There's somebody doing something and I'll figure it out later. But then I go back like halfway through, I'm like, oh, this happened at the beginning of the story. That has to play out. Maybe I can do something interesting with that. So if I I've tried to come up with plot twists. It never works. Never works. No, it's never worked. I can't do it.
Did you know the Desert was going to die?
Did I know she was going to die?
Yeah. When you started out.
No, I didn't know she was going to die.
That seemed like a plot twist to me.
It seems like but I didn't set out. So I guess I did, but by accident. Yeah. No, I didn't. I can't set up like, and then at the end, or I've had students come up to me. I'm teaching creative writing, which I love. And we talk about character, and we read great stories. And I've had students come up to me sometimes like, well, I think this is going to be my plot twist in my story. I'm like, but what's the story about? Like, well, I don't know. I got to figure that out. But no, you don't figure out the plot twist and then write the story. You write the story and then see where it's going. Yeah. I mean, again, I think some people can probably do it. So I can't. Unless it's accidental. That's all. Yeah.
You mentioned that you'll think of something that happened at the beginning of the story and be like, oh, that has to see its way out or play out. Is that like in the writing process that you're thinking about that, or is that more like as you're going back and editing?
Probably both. Yeah. Because I really rarely know how the story's going to end. So I like to, I sort of subconsciously, I think, plant clues for myself at the beginning of the story. And sometimes they don't play out. Like sometimes I put too much stuff in the beginning. That has to go. Like I'm trying to cover too much. There's too many things going on. But once I do get a whole draft, especially if I usually write like so many different endings, like 4, 5, 6 endings. Sometimes I'll overwrite an ending. The best thing that happens, and I always have trusted friends to read it. And like Troy will read my stories, and some of my colleagues will read them. And the best thing is when you give the story to somebody and they're like, you know what, your ending is like half a page up. Just cut that last half page and then you're done. Like that has happened sometimes. Just overwrite. And it's like, oh, it ended. Or sometimes it ends like a page and a half earlier, That's nice when that happens, you just chop off a bunch. But usually it's like, all right, this isn't working. This character is either not changed at all, which maybe is okay, or they just changed too drastically, or just, one story recently that I read to Troy, I said, what did you think of the ending? And he said, was that the ending? And I was like, oh, too subtle. So that was a clue. And I haven't figured out what to do with that. So maybe it needs a plot twist. Maybe it does.
Do you ever find yourself so in love with language that you're not wanting to cut it, but it just has to be cut?
No, I'm all for cutting.
Oh, good.
I'm all for cutting. Yes, but that's what it's like. It's not gone forever. I use it for parts. I chop it up and it goes in other things. It's a file. And it has happened that I've had one story that's not working, another story where that's not working. If I stick them together, they work.
Frankenstory.
It's a Frankenstory. I love Frankenstory. It's the best when that happens. Yeah, but I'm all for cutting. I have no.
You don't fall in love with your words.
No. If I did, whatever, I can keep it. Like it's not like it's gone forever. It's not like I broke it. You
Right.
know?
You didn't murder it.
No, it's fine. Yeah. I mean, I have had it happen where I lost my computer crashed and my what is that thing called? The USB thing crashed
Jump
at the
drive.
same time. The jump drive and the computer crashed at the same time. So now I email stuff and print stuff and all of that. But,
I use Dropbox.
and Dropbox. Yeah.
Google Drive.
I use all of it. I'm not taking any chances.
Never again.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we are here because of NaNoWriMo and National Novel Writing Month. And so I wanted to get your take on what do you think of NaNoWriMo, I guess, to start with.
Well, great. How great is that? And I have students who have done it. I'm always so impressed, like how, on top of all their other work, they're doing that. It's amazing. And I think I've never done it. It sort of intimidates me, but I would love to try it someday for sure. But you really can't go wrong. I mean, even whether you're a short story writer or whatever, like you're just generating stuff and there's no time for writer's block. Like it just has to do it. Yeah. Are you gonna do it?
Maybe next year.
What do you think about just this? I mean, part of the idea of it, right, is the 50,000 words in a month, no revisions. Just like, you know, getting it out. Do you work like that, or do you find yourself revising as you go?
I have to get it out, but it's, you know, like for my thing, so I get up every morning at 5 and write for like maybe 45 minutes, and just sort of like without doing anything, just coffee, you know, that's what I need. And then just write nonsense sometimes, and then go back and look at it. So, and so I think there's something to be said for just getting that out. Again, not every writer writes that way. I think there's some that have to, like, but I don't know, I think whatever works. And I think 50,000 words in a month, you're going to get something. You're going to get something that you can use for something, I would think. Maybe there's a bunch of stories in there. There's poems in there. You know.
Did you do the artist way? Is that why you're that practice of getting up and just writing for 45 minutes first thing?
No, is that a thing?
Yeah, it's a thing. Somebody wrote a book. You could have written that book.
Well, no, I just have to, I'm very, like, I'm a morning person. So, like, after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I can't do anything creative. Like, by evening, I'm just done. So, like, I just do, I think everybody has to find their own thing. Like, I ask my students, like, what do you have to do to write? Some of them, they need loud music and they need to work from midnight to 1 or whatever. Like, just do it. Do what you have to do.
What's one of the most interesting answers you've gotten to that question?
Gosh, that's a good question. I feel like there have been some weird things that I can't remember right now. But I'm always surprised that some people need loud noise, like really loud music to work, which I can't because I'm just sort of like I get lost in the music. I can't do it. Yeah, I can't remember, but I will remember next time somebody tells me something strange.
But you gotta get to the full responses.
Yeah.
So you mentioned taking the time. I guess we kind of talked about this, but just going back and taking like the time at the beginning of the day to write. Are you writing like with a purpose in that moment, or is it just sort of like a daily ritual?
It's probably both. I mean, I try to do it, at least write a little bit every day. Like, I'm not one of those people who can sit down. If I had a 4-hour block of time, I couldn't write for 4 hours. Like, I couldn't do it. But if I have 45 minutes, I have to do that. Like, I can do 45 minutes. I can do like a paragraph, or I can stare at a page. And I'm only staring at it for 45 minutes. It's okay. Like, so I thought if I stop doing it for too long, then it's harder to go back to. And if it's just like getting up at 5 is not easy. It's not pleasant at all. But it's like, all right, I'm doing it. If I can put in 45 minutes, and then I feel like I've done something for the day. And even when I was in graduate school, I was working 2 jobs. And for a while, I didn't even have a computer. This is the 90s. Like, I didn't have my own computer. So I'd go to the office and work like before like half an hour. I would do everything in half an hour or 15-minute bursts of time. And I'd just be thinking the rest of it. Think. I got 15 minutes. All right, get it out. And wrote a lot that way. I wish I could write for 4 hours. I have friends, I have colleagues who are like, yep, I just had a big chunk of 6 hours, I could get a lot done. I'm like, if I had a big chunk of 6 hours, I'd get nothing.
I get a nap.
I get a nap.
A good nap.
Yeah.
As a professor, what kind of advice do you give to your students when they're coming to you with questions about writing, and just sort of like, I feel like, I don't know, for me, it's all getting started is really hard, and then like finishing is really hard. So like, what kind of advice do you like to share with your students?
Well, I like to give them, to get started, I give them prompts, and we read a bunch of stories, and we look at like what's happening in this story. There are this first sentence of this story, there's 2 problems happening at once. If you can get 2 problems happening at once in your first sentence, like just after, and then someone would do like random things, like just after her car broke down, she got home and found somebody had stolen her favorite cactus or something. Like then you're like, cactus? Why? What's the favorite cactus? And just like sets little things to keep going. So I tell them like, just pick 2 things, nothing huge, but just 2 things to give your character to deal with. And then if you run out of, it's going to be harder to run out of steam. So we look at published stories and like this story's got 2 problems at once, and then there's some dialogue, and then there's this description of setting. Just try that, to get them going. And I tell them to mind their own lives and their friends' lives and their families' lives and things they've overheard. And I tell them to eavesdrop on people. It's very useful. And like don't just write about yourself because it's not memoir, and it's like just because that happened doesn't mean you can't change it. Sometimes they'll get stuck and they're like, but it really happened this way. I'm like, but the character's not you. Like this character is going to do maybe the opposite. Like you, this is your evil twin. This character is not going to do what you do. This character is not going to do the sensible thing, perhaps. And to think of a character who's their life is about to change in some way. Get as close to that change as possible. Like this is the day they're going to do something they've never done before. What's it going to be? But as for ending stories, sometimes I tell them like, think about what did you set up at the beginning of the story. I tell them like, or at least for your first story, let it take place over a short time period. You have to write about what happened over the course of a year, but what happened over the course of this day or 2 days or something. But endings are hard. But I do tell them to try to write, like a lot of them want to write stuff that they've seen on TV or like, movies, plots that somebody else has already done. So I try to make them think of like, what is the thing that only they can write? Like only they can write that combination of things. And if it's a movie, like when I first started teaching creative writing, Fight Club had just come out, like this is many, many years ago. And guess what happened at the end of every single story? Like there's 2 people just ruined Fight Club. If anyone hasn't seen it, there's the same person. Anyway, I just ruined it for you. But
I've seen it.
But anyway, but anyhow, that was like so many stories that ended like that. I was like, no, like you can't do that because.
We talked about writer's luck last week.
Oh, yeah.
And 2 people said that it didn't exist on this panel of 3 people. I said that it did exist and gave some of the tips that I have for getting past writer's luck, and I'm desperate to hear what you do, or that you don't believe it exists either.
I think it exists. I think it's like because it's not about running out of things to write about. Like there's like tons of things to write about. Like even just go back and like my students are stuck on like what about the backyard, your backyard when you were 4, or what your first or a thing when you got in trouble when you were a kid. Like there's tons of stuff to write about. It's like you get in your own way. And the writer's block is you saying like, oh, that's stupid. Oh, that's stupid. Oh, that's stupid. Don't do that. And then you're like, it's not the lack of stuff to write. It's yourself. So that's, So what I do is I just say, I'm gonna write something stupid, like this, and sometimes I do. So, or then if I'm really, really stuck, then I'll just read stuff. Like, I think I'm just stuck, and like nothing of use is gonna come from this. Just read stuff. But I think, so for some people it doesn't exist, or?
I think it was a trick.
No.
It was a gimmick. I don't believe in that. I don't believe it doesn't exist.
So is there anything that maybe we didn't touch on, but that you would like to share that you really had on like the heart of your mind that you wanted to talk about?
No. I wrote it all out.
Well,
We have an online question.
ooh, we have an online question.
Yes. So Victoria from Zoom would like to know, do you ever surprise yourself by where your characters end up or where your story ends up?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's like, I love that when that happens. Because you start off and you don't like, it's like, where it starts. But sometimes where they end up, it's really surprising. Not always, but when that happens, it's great. And then sometimes the story does surprise me. Sometimes it takes a turn I didn't see coming, and sometimes like during like those 5 a.m. writing things, something will come to me and I'll realize, oh, this is what happens in that story I gave up on 2 months ago. Like that was it. And so it's like, sometimes it's a gradual surprise. Like I put something away for a while and then it's like, hey, guess what? here's what happens. So that's another reason, like when I get up at 5, like sometimes it's not just that I'm going to sit down and write something that's even going to turn out to be published, maybe not, but sometimes it'll be the clue to something I didn't expect that I'd already sort of stopped thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like it happens. Doesn't happen enough.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Since you're writing short stories, have you found that it can be difficult sometimes to make the characters really complex in such a short word count?
What I found, because sometimes you can do that, like you want to know about their past, and then you have to add a whole lot of backstory, which makes the story go backwards instead of forwards. What I found is sometimes if you know enough about the character, you can drop in little hints in the present action of what they're doing, like I can't even think of an example right now, but like the field what reminded her of where she would go, the cows that her father raised, and they're like, okay, well apparently her father had cows. I got to find out about that. Like just drop in little things that build up the complexity. So like what I tell my students is like your characters have to have like texture. Like you need to know what their job is. You need to know what they like, what is unstable in their lives right now. And I actually find it harder when I try to write something longer to make them more complex. I feel like I'm just like going in circles, I feel like I can get across the stuff going on in their lives in 12 pages. But that's a good question because it is hard. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question? All right. Thank you, Becky.
All right.